Okay, so these this is the last set of lectures, um, or I should say, the last lecture cycle. This particular presentation. Um, so there'll be a number of lectures going into the final week, and basically it's looking at the world post World War II, what is normally defined as the Cold War. So that's what this is about. It's the navigating that world and kind of lead into our world, which they call the globalized world. Okay, so if you recall, after World War II, um, the Allied powers win the war. Um, that basically leaves the Soviet Union and the United States in the driver's seat. Europe needs to be rebuilt. And what ends up happening is there's kind of a tug of war on who's going to be the big influencer. Is it going to be Soviet Union and communism, or is it going to be the United States and capitalism and liberal democracy? So, if you recall earlier in the semester, we talked about Stalin's view of communism was Stalinism was communism in one state. That has now evolved to revolution by conquest. The former Prime Minister of England during World War II, Winston Churchill, had kind of called out the Soviet Union by saying there was an Iron Curtain in the East. And basically, this revolution by conquest was the Soviet Union trying to create satellite states. And if you look at the map, you can see that this happens over here in Eastern Europe. So a lot of Eastern Europe will be under the control of the Soviet Union, including a split Germany. So basically, Germany was split with the Western side under the control of the Allies, particularly the U.S., and then the Eastern side was controlled by the Soviet Union and communism. Okay. And there was quite a threat. Countries like Greece and Turkey was threatened with this um, Cold War revolution of communism right after the war started. And so that led the U.S., which had been somewhat isolationist, especially when it came to like directly European affairs. It led the United States into actual global engagement, heading up NATO, which was an alliance of Western powers, Western democracies, and which led to the reaction of the Soviet Union into the Warsaw Pact, which was an alliance of communist states. Now, the president of the U.S. at the time, in the beginning of the Cold War, was Harry Truman, and the Truman Doctrine was this idea that U.S. presidents or U.S. should defend free states or democratic regimes across the world. And the Marshall Plan was this idea of doing this with the American dollar. So, probably the most successful rebuild strategy for the United States was in rebuilding Germany and rebuilding Japan. So, in general, if you think about nowadays or in the last like 50 years, both Germany, or at least Western Germany, and Japan are some of the closest allies to the United States. And the ultimate fear in the United States was that there would be basically a domino effect, that if one country goes communist, like a series of dominoes falling, its neighbors would go communist. Now, this is not exactly what happens, but that is at least the mindset within the U.S. And the stakes get raised once the Soviet Union successfully tests a bomb in 1949. And as we know, the United States ended World War II with two bombs. Well, while the U.S. is winning kind of the hearts and minds in Western Europe, especially with taking care of West Germany, the Soviets under Stalin initiate, or at least are open up the Korean War. So what happens here is that the Soviets know that they're losing in the West, and so they allow the dictator of North Korea, Kim Il Sung, to invade South Korea. Now, Korea was under Japanese occupation for most of the early 20th century, and after World War II, it was split between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so this move shows it really is kind of the first like direct conflict in the um, Cold War. Now, if you look at the map, you can kind of see how it transpires. That North Koreans make a really big push, and that South Korea um, at the tail end of the 1950s cries out to the United Nations for help. The U.S. and others intervene, so you can see that push back up north, and then China, which we'll talk about later, becomes communist. They help the North Koreans out, and then we're kind of at a stalemate. And basically, the situation in Korea is the same that happens. So what you get at the end of the Korean War is basically what you have up until today. Stalin dies mid 1950s, so this is then a push by the Soviet leaders under Khrushchev to basically come clean with a lot of the atrocities of Stalin, and to try to kind of reshape the narrative about like who, whether the Soviet Union or the United States has like the better moral foundation. This is not helped when a revolution breaks out in Hungary, and the Soviet Union topples that revolution with its military. So a lot of the European intellectuals tend to lean left, radical left, but they're having a hard time doing that with the heavy-handedness of the Soviet Union. All right. So this leads us to another subject, that of the post-colonial situation. And I would recommend watching the video off to the right from the regular Prezi lecture. So as you saw the last few weeks, and you're reading in Césaire, the non-European world kind of senses that Europe is no longer in a position to really hold on to its colonies, and so you get this pushback. Now, the sort of the pioneers of post-colonialism is in India with Gandhi, and Gandhi's famous for a number of reasons, but the big one is as this leader of this movement, he's doing this via a nonviolent political resistance, and this is a movement that inspires the civil rights movement in the United States among African American leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. What's crazy is after all the pushback against the British, and that eventually he is assassinated by Hindu radicals who see that he is way too Gandhi is way too comfortable with non-Hindu Indians, specifically Muslims. And so once the independence of India happens in 47, there is a kind of a split within India, and the creation of the nation of Pakistan, which has a Muslim population of a majority of Muslims. So already the kind of the Muslim leader in history was Muhammad al-Jinnah. And if you recall back as the Mughal Empire, that Muslims in India were kind of the minority. He realized this, and with the violence even exerted against Gandhi, they pushed for a creation of a new state. So once that happens in 48, you actually have Hindus and Muslims across this territory moving in different directions. So the Hindus moved into India, and the Muslims moved into Pakistan. It's been kind of a rough relationship since. Um, Now, throughout the Cold War, there was a movement called the Non-Aligned Movement, or NOM for short. This already shows from Gandhi onward that there was a number of leaders from the quote unquote so called third world that were pushing against the Cold War narrative. So if you look at this map here, it kind of shows you what the um, the Cold War lines look like. So basically, Western Europe and the United States are the first world. This Soviet bloc and China are the second world. So the communist bloc is the second world. And then pretty much everything else, what they sometimes label the global south, is the third world. And if you could look at that, you could tell like the third world is very diverse, right? You're basically including all Latin America, all of Africa, and a large chunk of Asia. So many leaders across the quote unquote third world got together. The most famous example was at Bandung, Indonesia, where there was this push for neutralism between the Soviet Union and uh, and the United States. In other words, these countries across the third world did not want to get wrapped up into Cold War dynamics, choosing either like American style capitalism democracy or Soviet Union styled communism. Anyways, and so early on, there was kind of this principal stance, especially led by Egyptian President Gamal Nasser and Nehru, Prime Minister of India. But things changed once you get into the 1960s with the successful revolution in China in 49 and the successful guerrilla operation in Cuba in 1959, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. This leads to the third world really opting for more guerrilla styled violent revolutions. And so, in other words, militancy. And so, the meeting in Havana really illustrate that the rise of all these guerrilla campaigns across specifically Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In fact, later on, even more figures like Indira Gandhi, who becomes a leader of India a couple of times. She's actually assassinated by Sikh militants in 1984. So it actually this turn to violence is not very helpful for this region that early on really tried to have a principled sense of nonviolent option. All right, so that leads me to close this particular lecture with the philosophy of the mid 20th century. It the big one coming out of Europe that was adopted across the world is existentialism, and I have a video on Simone de Beauvoir and even a short text from her book, The Second Sex. That you can kind of see this idea of like this hyper individualism, this sense of like individual freedom that her and Jean-Paul Sartre spoke about. Jean-Paul Sartre, who is a novelist, writer, probably the most important French philosopher in the late 20th century, major influence. Same thing with Albert Camus, who basically wrote, some call his philosophy absurdism. You know, these writers, Sartre, Beauvoir, Camus, were all writing in light of the horrors of World War II, and so they're kind of reflecting on that. Figures like Frantz Fanon, again, I have a video on him, basically talk about it from a position of the colonized, and then Che Guevara becomes kind of the darling of the revolutionary movement in the 60s. This idea of like, the only way to overthrow imperialism is through revolution in the streets. And so this sparks a number of revolutions in 1968 that actually don't end up violently, both in France and Mexico, for example, and even in the United States. And then just closing and looking at like the poetry and the playwriting of Samuel Beckett, playing on this idea of everything's created